So you've probably been recording videos for a while, and you might be thinking, it might be time to switch off of all the auto settings and actually figure out what all of the technical terms mean. But it's kind of daunting, and you might think, well, why not just stick with all the auto settings and let the camera do the work? Hello, I'm Leif from Anything Cameras, the channel that focuses on helping you improve your filming and photography. And I'm going to get right to it. Why bother learning these settings? Auto mode works just fine, and all these settings seem boring and complicated. I'm not a nerd, why should I learn it? The answer is, it gives you more control. But then that raises the question, why do you need more control? Auto mode can only know so much. It's not as smart as a human. It might not set the correct parameters for a video in certain situations to get the best result. So this means, if you have control over the settings and understand how to use them, you, as a human, can process a lot more information visually than the camera can, meaning you can get a better looking image most of the time. When I say better looking, not only do I mean higher quality, but I also mean the look that you're going for to achieve a certain emotion. With auto mode, it's kind of like early self-driving cars. They didn't used to be able to tell the difference between a crumpled piece of paper or a rock. So the rock would be an issue, but the paper wouldn't. And cameras' auto modes are a lot like this. If it sees two different scenes as basically the same thing, then it could make the wrong decisions and the video wouldn't turn out too good. One time on our old channel, we were shooting outside when a cloud came over and shadowed us. Now we had two settings that were set to auto that we shouldn't have had set to auto. And that was the aperture and the white balance. Now the aperture is just determining how much light gets into the camera and how much is in focus. Now when you set the aperture to auto aperture, the camera will try to keep the same exposure on the image. However, when a photography camera switches its aperture, it looks jarring. It'll get a step brighter and a step brighter, or a step darker and a step darker. This does not look good. Now if we had left it on manual, the cloud would have come over and we could have eased up the exposure to account for the darkening image. This could have been done either in camera or in post-production, and you wouldn't have been able to tell. Now I mentioned white balance, and this is how the camera processes something that is white. So if I said my skin is perfect white, well then the camera would assume my skin's perfect white, and everything, all the other colors, would be calculated based on that. This would mean that everything in the image would be super blue because my skin is more orangey, and when you tell the camera that orange is actually white, then everything else shifts to blue, and this can be done in reverse. Now why would you want to mess with that? Why not just keep white as white? Well, depending on the lighting setup, you need to change this. Think about it. Indoor lights are more orange, so they cast an orange hue onto white surfaces, making them look orange to the human eye. Now, if you want to render a perfectly lit image with accurate colors, you need to tell the camera that the slightly orange-tinged white surface is actually white. What the cloud did in our outside scenario is it came over and it blocked the sun's rays, making the image a little bit cooler. Auto white balance also has the same effect as an auto aperture. It is jerky when it moves between different white balances. This caused the image to abruptly change the color, and everything looked different. If I all of a sudden change the white balance, it's going to be jarring. It's not going to look good. If you do something slow and progressive that lasts a while, you might not actually notice it. 5 seconds ago, this is what it looked like. Now, see what I mean? If you do it progressively and slowly, you can make fine changes and it won't be very apparent. However, if you leave the camera to do it all the time, it'll become very jarring and abrupt, and it'll ruin your video. So now you know why we need to set settings manually, and you even know what white balance is as a result. So let's move on to some other settings. We're going to start with some basic video quality terms. So now we have a video that goes super in depth into video quality, so if you want to check that out, link down in the description or up in the cards. However, in this video I'm just going to be kind of glossing over these terms so I can get into other aspects of manual settings, such as enhancing your storytelling using them. Let's start with the most basic one, resolution. And this is super simple. It's how many pixels are in your image. A 1080p image is 1080 pixels tall and 1920 pixels wide. That is HD video. Now if you go up in resolution to something like 4K, that is 4000 pixels wide, or roughly thereabouts. And this resolution has more pixels, making it sharper and adding detail to the image. So basically, the more pixels in the image, the sharper it'll be, and generally the more detail you'll have. Now, this is not always the case, because if you have a very cheap lens, the lens might not be sharp enough to fully take advantage of your camera's full resolution. Think about it. If you're shooting 8K but your lens is really crappy, there's no way you're going to be able to utilize the full resolution. The next one is frame rate. A video is just a series of photos taken very fast, and frame rate just tells the camera how many photos per second it should take. Very common is 24 frames per second. That's in the movie industry. If you're over in Europe, you would probably see 25 frames per second. On YouTube and many basic photography cameras that also do video, you will see 30 frames per second, and that's generally what most people shoot at. There's also 60 frames per second, which can be used as slow-mo video, because you can record the 60 frames per second and then play back those frames at 30 frames per second, which means every second of video you recorded in post can turn into two seconds. Now, how can we utilize this knowledge of settings to improve our storytelling? Well, I'm going to start with resolution. If you have a higher resolution, this gives you a more detailed image, which can show the viewer more. And if you're going to export your video at a lower resolution than what you're recording in, you can digitally zoom in post-production to emphasize something in the video. For example, if I wanted to show that a character was surprised by something, I could do a quick punch in to show their reaction to it and really emphasize their surprise. So let's move on to the next settings. These three settings I'm about to cover are called the exposure triangle. Again, there's a full video about this on our channel, but here's a brief overview. Let's start out with a pretty basic one, and this is shutter speed. Shutter speed is just the speed at which your shutter actuates, and for video, you just want the denominator of your shutter speed, because all shutter speed is shown with a fraction, so that means the bottom number needs to be twice your shutter speed. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. This is to achieve the proper motion blur in the image, and while you can mess around with this and adjust it, generally this is what you want to shoot at. Again, to understand this more fully, we have another video detailing all of this. Next one is aperture, which I already explained briefly. Aperture is just the iris in your lens, and it can open up wider or close down smaller. The wider it gets, the more light is allowed to hit your sensor. The smaller it gets, the less light is allowed to hit your sensor. And this does affect how much of your image is in focus. A wide aperture means only a small plane of your image will be in focus, whereas a small aperture means that most of your image will be in focus. This gets super sciencey, not going to get into it right here. Finally, in the exposure triangle, we have ISO. And this is just how much digital gain is applied to the image off your sensor. So your sensor captures a certain amount of light, and sometimes this is not enough light. What your camera does then is increase digitally the amount of light that the camera sees. This will brighten the image, but it also has a few side effects. One being graininess. This graininess can be seen in either color grain, which is blue, red, and green dots throughout the image, or it can just look kind of gritty. So how does the exposure triangle affect storytelling? So now this series is just a mini series. Now there is another episode coming out soon that Noah will be hosting all about editing, and you can see that in the cards. However, what if you want to get more in depth on this topic? We do have an online course called From Recording to Uploading, and we're currently working on a version 2 of it. Currently, you can buy our course for 40% off, and when the next version comes out, you will receive this update with no extra charges. The next version will be more expensive than our current version, so make sure to get this deal before it runs out. For one, you might want a scene to be slightly overexposed or slightly underexposed. Overexposed means too bright, underexposed means too dark. Think about it. Say if you have a scene where somebody dies and goes to heaven. You might want to portray it as bright, very light, white, even intensely bright. And you can see this in many movies that portray heaven. Now, if you're shooting a film where your character goes into a cave and you want the lighting to be dark and spooky, well, then you're going to want to underexpose your image. And by having control and understanding of the exposure triangle, you can set the appropriate settings to make sure you have the correct exposure and the image also looks good. And the next setting you need to look at is color. Your sensor can interpret colors differently. And in your camera, you have what are called color profiles. These different color profiles can help you achieve a certain look to help you tell your story. What professionals tend to do is they'll shoot in a log color profile or HLG or raw, but technically not a color profile. Complicated. We won't get into that right now because you don't need to know. What these color profiles do is create a more detailed and flat image so that you can have more flexibility when adjusting colors in post-production. This process of adjusting color is called color grading, and this is a very important part of storytelling. Throughout this mini-series of videos, we have used color grading to set a tone or to show something, to emphasize it. For example, in our lighting video, when we showed off spooky lighting, it wasn't just the lighting that was adjusted, it was also the color grading. This color grade emphasized how dark and spooky the image was. So to bring it back to our heaven and a cave analogy, bringing white balance into it this time, we may want to achieve a colder look in the cave to be more cold and menacing. And in heaven, we might want it warmer. We might want it more inviting. We want to make it seem appealing. And with the flexibility to edit your colors in post with color grading, you can achieve basically any look you're going for. And as I said, be sure to watch the next episode on editing right here. Then that raises the question, why do you need more control? Well, I mean, if you're a control freak and that's what you do, then obviously, but I guess. Next one is Aperture, which I already explained. No, you did me in.